economics, education, entertainment, labor, law, politics, religion, sex, and war.
If you do not understand racism, which is white supremacy, what it is and how it works, everything else that you understand will only confuse you. Confuse you. Confuse you. Confuse you. Confuse you. If you do not understand, confuse you. If you do not understand, confuse you. If you do not understand, confuse you. Confuse you.
My definition of white supremacy and racism, I use those two terms as synonyms. I use the same definition for both terms. That definition is as follows: a global system of people who classify themselves as white and are dedicated to abusing and or subjugating everyone in the known universe whom they classify as not white.
Economics, education, entertainment, labor, law, politics, religion, sex, and war.
There is a fifth dimension, beyond that which is known to man. It is a dimension as vast as space and as timeless as infinity. It is the middle ground between light and shadow, between science and superstition, and it lies between the pit of man's fears and the summit of his knowledge. This is the dimension of imagination. It is an area which we call the Twilight Zone.
Summer is upon us, and so it's time for our regular summer reading series. Now, often when we think of books for this season, we think about beach-friendly novels full of adventure and romance. But since this year marks the 50th anniversary of many pivotal events in the civil rights movement, so-called Freedom Summer, we decided to dive into books that explore the theme of freedom. And we're going to start with one of the cornerstones of the movement, nonviolent resistance. You will have seen this in countless old news clips and even depicted in movies like The Butler. You'll have seen activists courageously withstanding abuse by fellow citizens and law enforcement. But what you did not see and might not have known about until now is that passive resistance in public protest did not necessarily mean an unwillingness to use force to protect themselves from violence in other circumstances. This hiding in plain sight story is recounted by the author, Professor Charles E. Cobb Jr. in his new book, This Nonviolent Stuff Will Get You Killed, How Guns Made the Civil Rights Movement Possible. And Professor Cobb is with us now. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Michelle.
What gave you the idea for this book? Or for this history, really, to kind of dig into this?
Well, as a writer, I'm very much concerned with how the history of the Southern freedom movement or civil rights movement is portrayed. And I'm very conscious of the gaps in the history. And one important gap in the history, in the portrayal of the movement, is the role of guns in the movement. I worked in the South. I lived with families in the South. There was never a family I stayed with that didn't have a gun. I know from personal experience and the experiences of others that guns kept people alive, kept communities safe, and all you have to do to understand this is simply think of black people as human beings, and they're going to respond to terrorism the way anybody else would.
Now, early in the book, you start off explaining how guns became an important part of Southern culture. The fact is that during this era of kind of intense repression, blacks were specifically forbidden from having guns previously, and those were among the things that they sought to acquire. How is that important, or why did that become important?
Well, first, I would say that right from the beginning of the country's history, going all the way back, say, to the Jamestown colony in the 17th century and the days of slavery, guns and weapons were forbidden to black people. I mean, weapons, for obvious reasons, are associated with rebellion, and one of the big fears in the South was slave rebellion. After the Civil War, guns were, you had all these black soldiers who had fought in the Union Army coming back home with weapons. So states, particularly in what's called the First Reconstruction, attempted to disarm blacks blacks. And that was not all that successful. You see, if we were really doing a deep look at this period, say between the end of the Civil War and the start of World War I, you'd see instance after instance of blacks in the rural South fending off the Ku Klux Klan and others with weapons. It's the period what historian Vincent Harding, who just passed away, called the period of great black protests.
This is not a test. This is your emergency broadcast system announcing the commencement of the annual purge sanctioned by the U.S. government. Weapons of Class 4 and lower have been authorized for use during the purge. All other weapons are restricted. Government officials of ranking 10 have been granted immunity from the purge and shall not be harmed. Commencing at the siren, any and all crime, including murder, will be legal for 12 continuous hours. Police, fire, and emergency medical services will be unavailable until tomorrow morning at 7 a.m. when the purge concludes. Blessed be our new founding fathers and America, a nation reborn. May God be with you all.
What it is, and how it works.
On this day, 100 years ago, many black people brutally beaten and lynched by white Navy sailors. May 10th, 1919 was the day. Violent conflicts, known as the Charleston race riots, took place in the streets here downtown Charleston.
Yeah, it's a story that's often forgotten. News 2's Deanne Roberts spoke with an historian who uncovers this piece of hidden history.
But the injuries are unknown.
Taking a walk through history.
They were beaten up pretty badly, though.
Pointing out the missing pieces of a story that often gets buried.
Sailors basically came through here on their way to the largely African-American community up here.
Historian Damon Fordham telling me about the May 10th, 1919 Charleston race riot and 8 hours of chaos between white Navy sailors and African-Americans.
The sailors wanted to buy some liquor, and the person who they gave money to never returned with it. So they were already drunk, and they began assaulting black people from King Street on up,
leaving people running for their lives.
The young Septima Clark, who was later become a civil rights leader, she ran into her home over on Henrietta Street behind Mother Emanuel and hid while they were marauding.
Fordham says that's when African Americans began fighting for their lives.
African Americans came out in the streets and began to fight back against the assaulters, so much so that the mayor had to call the Marines to put down the riot.
Many waking up to these headlines, learning 2 African Americans were killed, a black-owned barbershop that used to sit here at 305 King Street was destroyed, and countless others injured. Fordham says an interracial commission met, and soon after, many sailors were arrested and 2 were even imprisoned for the lynchings. It's an act of justice that was unheard of at that time.
There was a case where justice was actually done in the aftermath of a riot and a lynching at a time when that was very unusual.
This piece of history is often forgotten.
This type of thing has to be better known so that people don't make the mistake of letting these type of things happen again.
Fordham hoping one day this story will be widely known.
The Charleston race riot was one of the first of more than 36 race riots that happened in the summer of 1919 across the nation. For more information on the race riots, visit our website, counton2.com. Reporting in studio, Deanne Roberts, Count on 2.
And all you have to do to understand this is simply think of black people as human beings, and they're going to respond to terrorism the way anybody else would.
You are now listening to P.A.R. People Activity Radio, and I'm your host. John G. Horse. Welcome. You have found your family in a peaceful place. P.A.R. aims to be a family-friendly information distribution program seeking to inform non-white people, in particular black classifieds, and assistant in counter-racist codification. The title of today's show is the 1919 Charleston, South Carolina race clash, standing by your work and the myth of Black American cowardice. Today, John G. Horse is delighted to bring what I consider to be some constructive information that will contribute to less confusion as it pertains to foundational Black Americans and the myth of Black American cowardice. I found in the school curriculum of the United States of America, when talking about people who are classified as Black and or African American, Negro, colored, or whatever else they calling us at the time that they calling us, we are pummeled and beat down by stories and a legacy of submission. Here on People Activity Radio, we aim to remove that confusion by dealing with the facts, by dealing with the evidence, by bringing forth receipts. Today, we are delighted to talk about another incident in United States history involving racism, white supremacy. We find ourselves analyzing the event called in news publications the 1919 Charleston, South Carolina race riot, right here on P.A.R. People Activity Radio. We are going to use Black self-respect and rename the incident the 1919 Charleston, South Carolina racial clash. Because it wasn't no riot. It wasn't nothing but violence, racial mob violence, and counter racist violence by the Black American, the foundational Black American community of Charleston, South Carolina. And if you can tell by my energy, and you can tell by my words that I'm choosing, I am delighted to bring this information forth. With the assistance of author Professor Damon L. Fordham, let's get into the information and cue the clear.
Here's the lesser-known story of the Charleston race riot of 1919. On the night of May the 10th, 1919, a group of white sailors from the local Navy yard they were down at King and George Street, which is in the lower part of downtown Charleston. And they paid a young black man $20 to buy some bootleg liquor for them. Well, guess what? He never showed up. So, after they realized they'd been cheated out of their money, rumors spread that a black man had killed a couple of white sailors, and as was often the case in those days, they got kind of violent about this. And soon the white sailors went on a rampage on King Street, which is Charleston's main thoroughfare. And they went around randomly attacking black residents, dragging them off the streetcars and beating them in the streets. Two local black men, Isaac Doctor and William Brown, were known to have been shot to death by the sailors. And W.G. Furdy, an African-American who owned a barbershop on 305 King Street, had his shop destroyed by the growing mob. The Charleston News and Courier of May the 11th, 1919 also added, persons seated in a fashionable restaurant were unwilling spectators of all of this. The legendary Charleston civil rights leader, Miss Septima Clark, who in the 1960s was the education director of Martin Luther King's SCLC. She helped educate adults so they could learn to read and write and register to vote. She was 21 years old when all this took place. And in 1981, she told what happened to an interviewer by the name of Peter Wood. We had trolley cars then, and these sailors got on and started beating every black person they could find. They killed one or two of them. That Sunday night, nobody could go out. You had to stay in. The Citadel Square, which is now known as Marion Square Park, was filled with screaming and hollering, and we ran back into the house. However, many black Charlestonians retaliated against this violence. You see, these sailors made a terrible mistake. they took this violence to Charleston's east side. And then as now, if you know anything about Charleston, those folks on the east side, they don't play. And they didn't back then either. James Holloway, who was a local black resident, told an interviewer by the name of Augustus Ladson some 20 years later this following story. When the news went out in the Negro community what was happening, armed men came running through the streets with knives, hammers, hatchets, guns, razors, and sticks, and wholeheartedly joined the fight. On every street in that section, blood was shed. Negroes and white boys who were eager for excitement entered and fought until they were beaten and exhausted. He also added this interesting anecdote. He recalled that when one officer was asked if he did not search and disarm cars that were filled with blacks for guns as he was ordered to, the patrolman responded, "Yes, sir, but every car I stopped was filled with either revolvers or guns, which were pointed directly at me." You see, when people talk about the race riots of this period and racial incidents and so forth, there's one detail that's often left out. You see, it's often portrayed as if the whites went in and just totally destroyed the black communities with no one fighting back and all that. Well, there were many cases where the African Americans back then gave as good as they got in retaliation for these things. That's a very little known part of the story. Anyway, Charleston's Mayor Tristan Hyde heard about this event and he was like, "Oh no, I'm not having this in this city." Because he understood the numerical majority of the black population of Charleston, and he knew he'd have a mess on his hands if this thing went way too far. So he called out the National Guard as well as the Marines. And the Marines and the local police stopped the riot by the next morning. Well, not too long after that, several black organizations, the Interdenominational Ministerial Union, along with the Charleston branch of the NAACP, which included Edwin Harleston of the city's Harleston Bowes Funeral Home, Benjamin Cox, the principal of the Avery Institute, a black private school in Charleston, as well as Miss Susan Dart Butler, the founder of the Dart Library for Negroes in Charleston, which still operates, by the way. They met with Mayor Hyde to discuss the riot. They demanded black policemen in Charleston, compensation for blacks who lost property in the riot, punishment of the sailors, and a biracial committee to prevent that kind of violence in the future. Well, Mayor Hyde agreed to many of these demands. The murderers of William Brown and Isaac Doctor were caught and persecuted. The black businesses were recompensated for the riot, and an interracial committee was formed. But Charleston did not get black policemen for another 30 years.
And there you have it. Damon L. Fordham. Damon L. Fordham. Straight no chaser. Bars. And that was his commentary found on his YouTube channel titled The American Storyteller. Damon L. Fordham is also a professor and author. If you Google his name, you can find his information. And I think he is one of the utmost reputable information gatherers as it pertains to Carolina, South Carolina's illustrious history of counter-racist violence and black self-respect. But I digress. Back to the topic of the show, Charleston, South Carolina, and the event of the 1919 Charleston, South Carolina race clash, which, as you heard Damon L. Fordham present, all started by some drunken white Navy sailors, most likely frequenting the black side of town, which was a tradition of people who classify themselves as white anytime they want to indulge in some of the lower economy pleasures or lower economy behaviors. They would always stumble behind to the black side of town, in particular where black folks are attempting to enjoy themselves by listening to music, drinking back then what was moonshine, because at that time alcohol was illegal at the time. So some of the best moonshine, some of the best music, some of the finest women, some of the best dancing, some of the best eats, and I can go on and on with some of the best, is always found on the black side of town. You understand me? So they coming over there looking for some drink, or as they would call it back in that day, some moonshine. And they in the business district and or the night district, calling some dude over, some brother talking about something, go find us some drink and here go the money. Let me tell you something. You go to any community, lower income community, and tell somebody to do something for you, get them money, and they leave, you're not gonna see that money again. Come on now. But in this particular case, these sailors thought to themselves, well, if I ain't gonna get no drink and we done lost no money, some money, let's go on and take it out on these Negroes. But let's just make up anything that we feel, accuse anybody, because they all look alike, all these darkies look alike, of doing something to us to justify us terrorizing, lynching, raping, stealing, destroying property, whatever we want to do. Now, it's funny how the story is a couple of sailors, but by the time we get to the events, it's a mob of white sailors killing, lynching, beating, and destroying businesses. Just an organized white mob. I suspect that the military, the white military faction of Charleston, South Carolina, had a real big problem with the economic foundation of the foundational Black Americans during that time. You have to understand, in these times, foundational Black Americans were not only segregated and separated from the white community, they were prospering as the white community was in a so-called depression. Everything that you can think of, the foundational Black American community produced. Everything, every service that was needed, they provided. And under that context, you can imagine certain elements within the white community that were not familiar with Charleston, South Carolina's economic base, foundational Black American economic base, could have a real problem with that. They tried to do the white mob takeover, and what happened was word got on the street that white folks was doing what they do, and the code red kicked in. And in natural fashion, you picking a fight with street dudes. You gave a street dude some paper. The street dude took your paper, and you were supposed to chalk that up as a loss. And I suspect that the so-called sailors in question went back to the barracks, went back to the ship, wherever they were harboring or residing, got a sizable number of white sailors, and then ascended upon the Black American business district in South Carolina, Charleston, South Carolina, and decided they was gonna touch Negroes up. In particular, they probably was looking for soft targets. You know, people getting on the train, getting off work, people, you know, trying to have a good time with their woman. You know, people just not really trying to deal with white folks on that level. They knocking people upside the head on the trolley. They beating people upside the head in the streets who trying to have a good time. And they decided that they wanted to ascend upon business. And I gotta understand, when you got a business in the black district during these times, let's just be honest, in the under economy, you probably had street organizations that were getting paid by these businesses for protection. Wink, wink. Who are you protecting me from? Well, you're protecting me from you. But in this particular case, the protection was the street dudes protecting the entire foundational black community of Charleston, South Carolina, from a white military mob out for blood. The report said there were there were 4 foundational black Americans murdered in this event and or lynched. And the reports also say there were 2 members of the white mob that were killed. I am extremely suspicious of that count. Here on People Activity Radio, we make it a point to illuminate that we are subject to suspected racist, white supremacist news publications, so we don't know what the numbers was, but I suspect more white folk got taken off the planet that night because the National Guard and the Marines had to show up and were called by the mayor of South Carolina. Now, my question is, if the black community was getting pummeled, why couldn't the local white police department quell the violence? Because they was probably getting work too. Code red in these instances means anything white coming down them streets is gonna get the business. It's gonna get the work, badge or no. National Guard, the Marines were called in, and the violence was neutralized. Now, in most cases during these times, once the state guard, National Guard, or the military is called, they would usually side with the white mob and just wipe out the entire black community. But from my understanding from Professor Damon L's Fordham's presentation, the black community not only outnumbered the white community, not only had an economic base, they were known to put in work. If violated upon. And when they put in work, they stood by their work. And when I'm talking about standing by your work in the title is the 1919 Charleston, South Carolina racial clash. And standing by your work, and the myth of Black American cowardice, standing by your work as it pertains to the 1919 Charleston, South Carolina race clash, means them folk not only retaliated, the foundational Black Americans not only retaliated, they took some eyes for eyes and stood by their work. The military came in, they neutralized violence from both sides, and then there had to be a meeting of the elites from the white community and the black community. Now, let me say this. Usually they will bring in the so-called foundational Black American elites, especially in these times, who are extremely compromised and for less confusion in a lot of white people's pockets. But I digress. The elite community, business owners, educators, representatives in the local political realm that were black, met with white politicians and made demands. I'm going to say this one more time. 1919, Charleston, South Carolina. The black community made demands on the white community. They wanted to be compensated for damages on their properties. That's called justice. They wanted retribution, reparations for the damages on their property. I'm quite sure they was talking about medical bills being paid for from the white military mob. And the suspects, they demanded a real investigation. They wanted suspects to be brought to justice, which they were. And they were punished for the murders of innocent foundational black Americans. 1919, Charleston, South Carolina, riots, counter-racist violence practiced by the foundational black American community, and this was an example of survival and codification. Because you have 3 or 4 different levels of the black community working together in unison. See, segregation was not such a bad thing. The only thing that was bad when white mobs came into the areas in which we were in mass, we had the right to defend ourselves, but when we defended ourselves, usually the cavalry was called, the state guard, the national guard, the local police department, and they assisted the white mob in wiping us out. But in this case, 1919, Charleston, South Carolina, the foundational black community put in work, stood by their work, and they brought forth justice. Justice wasn't given to them. They demanded it, and they put in the work to get it. You understand me? And let's look at this in context of today's time. Even if we do want to recognize those black Americans that we find in the political realm as being part of our community, that would be an extreme contribution to your confusion, because after 1965, anybody who you found representing the so-called foundation of the black American community, they was bought and paid for. I'm not going to get into that. But in 1919, Charleston, South Carolina, the political community, the foundational black American politicians, the foundational black American business owners, the foundational black American landowners, the foundational black American blue-collar community, the foundational black American street community, all codified, work together for their survival. And the political community was able to say, hey, if you don't fix this problem, it's going to be some problems. That means we're not going to be able to control these street dudes because they looking for retribution. Here on P.A.R., we aim to remove confusion. That is our goal. That is our pleasure. And we're going to let Old Faithful Neely Fuller Jr. take us on home. Cue the clear.
What I mean by stand by your work, and that's explained briefly in the Counter-Racist Word Guide. Stand by your work should be like a mantra that's always in every person's head, white or non-white. In order to solve problems, you have to have clarity and focus. And everybody has to know where the problem is being made, who's making the problem, and what the results will be. And the only way to know that is that everybody stands by his or her work. You shouldn't have confusion, which the white supremacists are experts at causing confusion. Because when you can confuse people, you can always dominate them. That's just a law of the universe. So, every person should stand by his or her work, regardless of what that work is. If I am a carjacker, I shouldn't carjack somebody and make it look like somebody else did it. And those people should be exposed, whether they're white or non-white. I don't care what you do on this planet. If it involves other people, you should stand by your work. I don't care who you are or where you are. If you are a bus driver, and you are excellent at driving a bus, and someone asks you how many accidents you have had with your bus and all like that. Say, well, I didn't have any accidents, that were my fault and whatnot. So you stand by that work. But if you've had some accidents, you just say it. Well, I've been driving for 27 years, but I did have a minor fender bender, or I had a major collision, So you just say so. Why? Because it's true. That's all. That's what stand by your work means. And so if a black person kills another black person, or kills a white person, or carjacks someone, or breaks in somebody's house, and you should stand by your work. They say, well, did you do it? Yes, I did it. And if I get a chance, I'll do it again, because that's what I do. That's my work. I'm not going to have anybody taking credit for my work. I'll take credit for it. And if you don't like it, do whatever you want to do about it. But I'm not going to deny that I did what I did. Now, I'm saying this is the new world order, as it should be. This should be a part of everybody's code. You always admit what you did and explain why you did it to anybody who wants to know. You don't ever try to make it look like somebody else did what you did, or take credit for something that somebody else did that you didn't do. Stand by your work. Each and every person stands by whatever he or she does or says. Stand by it. You did it, stand by it. And all this stuff about, I'll do it, and don't you all snitch on me and let somebody else take the blame. Oh, no. Oh, no. Oh, no. Oh, no, 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 no. You had nerve enough to do it, have nerve enough to stand by it and take the lumps.
Neely Fuller Jr., straight no chaser, ball, and I hope I have contributed to less confusion. And remember, keep learning and stay codified.
Economics, education, entertainment, labor, law, politics, religion, sex, and war.
If you do not understand racism, which is white supremacy, what it is and how it works, everything else that you understand will only confuse you. Confuse you. Confuse you. Confuse you. Confuse you. If you do not understand, confuse you. If you do not understand, confuse you. If you do not understand, confuse you. Confuse you.
My definition of white supremacy and racism, I use those two terms as synonyms. I use the same definition for both terms. That definition is as follows: a global system of people who classify themselves as white and are dedicated to abusing and or subjugating everyone in the known universe whom they classify as not white.
Economics, education, entertainment, labor, law, politics, religion, sex, and war.